Anaya Khurana, a lonely Indian housewife in Los Angeles, and Rohan Delmar, her young neighbor's son, believed their secret affair was hidden behind suburban walls. But when Victor Khurana's body was found in his own home, their dangerous passion unraveled into a chilling story of betrayal, obsession, and murder. Anaya Khurana had always lived her life as if it were scripted for perfection. At 36, she was the image of grace, the housewife who never seemed out of place in her suburban Los Angeles neighborhood. Her neighbors often admired the way she carried herself, soft-spoken and well-dressed, with a smile that made her seem approachable yet distant. But behind that facade was a silence so heavy that even the ticking of her living room clock felt louder than her heartbeat. Her husband, Victor, was the provider every family wished for. At 42, he was a respected accountant, with a reputation for being reliable, trustworthy, and devoted to his work. Yet his devotion to work was the very thing that starved Anaya of the attention she craved. Day after day, Victor would leave early in the morning, tie neatly adjusted, briefcase in hand, his face already buried in the numbers that consumed him. He came home late, tired, and absent-minded, eating dinner in silence and retreating to his study until it was time to sleep. Their marriage looked intact from the outside, but inside the Khurana household, the cracks were wide enough to swallow the warmth of companionship. Anaya spent her afternoons staring out of the window, sipping tea, and wondering if this quiet life was all she had to look forward to. Across the street, the Delmar family lived in a modest, two-story house. Mrs. Delmar had been widowed years earlier, and her son, Rohan, had recently returned home for the summer. He was 21, tall, athletic, and carried himself with the restless energy of someone not yet settled in life. He often jogged down the street, headphones in, his shirt damp with sweat, his presence sharp and alive against the dull backdrop of Anaya's routine. She noticed him first in passing, just another young man in the neighborhood, but soon, her gaze lingered longer than it should have. The first time Rohan caught her eyes from across the street, it was nothing more than a polite exchange of acknowledgement, but something in that brief moment unsettled her. It reminded her of a spark she hadn't felt in years, a reminder that beneath the layers of housework, respectability, and responsibility, she was still a woman capable of longing. The days grew warmer, and Anaya found herself on her porch more often, pretending to water her plants or adjust her shawl while secretly watching Rohan. Loneliness played its tricks in quiet ways. The longer Victor remained buried in his world of ledgers and deadlines, the more Anaya drifted into her own silent rebellion. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was a hunger that built slowly, day by day, until it was impossible to ignore. She had friends, of course, women from her cultural circle in Los Angeles, but their conversations always revolved around children, recipes, and small gossip. None of them knew how she sat in her empty home and felt invisible, as though she were slowly dissolving into the wall. Rohan, meanwhile, was restless in his own way. College life had given him freedom, but returning home felt like a cage. The quiet suburbs suffocated him, and his mother's worried glances only added to his frustrations. He longed for excitement, something unpredictable to break the monotony. He began to notice Anaya more and more, the way she moved with quiet elegance, the way her eyes seemed to linger on him when she thought no one noticed. To him, she was not the typical neighbor's wife, but a mystery wrapped in layers of silence and restraint. The street they lived on was ordinary, children playing on sidewalks, cars pulling into driveways, mailboxes lined neatly along the curb. Nothing about it suggested danger or secrets. Yet within these neatly trimmed hedges and manicured lawns, a forbidden tension was beginning to form. Every glance between Anaya and Rohan was unspoken, but heavy with something neither wanted to admit aloud. It was in the stolen seconds when their eyes met, in the strange rhythm of curiosity that pulled them closer without a single word. For Anaya, those moments became the highlights of her day, the mundane chores of sweeping floors, folding laundry, and preparing dinner for Victor felt less heavy when she had that fleeting memory of Rohan's eyes on her. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was enough to awaken a part of her that had been asleep for too long. She didn't question the danger of it, she only savored the rush of feeling alive again. By the time summer deepened and the days grew longer, the quiet suburb that had always seemed so safe was already carrying a secret it could not contain. What began as harmless glances had planted the seed of a story that would unravel lives, and none of them, neither Anaya, nor Victor, nor Rohan, realized that the first step had already been taken towards something irreversible. What began as a simple glance across the street soon slipped into a dangerous rhythm that Anaya Khurana could not resist. Her days no longer felt like a monotonous cycle of chores and silence. Instead, she woke with a sense of anticipation, a restlessness that carried her through the hours until she found herself near the window, or the porch, hoping to catch sight of Rohan Delmar. Every moment she saw him jogging, carrying groceries, or simply standing outside his home, felt like an electric current rushing through her veins. It was reckless, but it gave her the illusion of control in a life where she had long felt powerless. Rohan, on his part, was not oblivious. He noticed how her eyes lingered, how her presence seemed to appear at just the right times. For him it was thrilling, intoxicating even, to realize that he had caught the attention of a woman like Anaya. She was older, graceful, and far more complex than the girls he knew at college. To him, she represented something forbidden, a challenge that made his otherwise dull summer worth living. Their connection began with stolen glances, but soon, opportunities for more began to present themselves. One afternoon, Rohan helped Miss Delmar carry groceries, and as he walked past the Khurana home, Anaya stepped outside under the pretense of collecting the mail. Their eyes met, and this time, there was no mistaking the unspoken acknowledgement between them. A quiet current passed, dangerous and heavy with suggestion. That moment marked a shift. The invisible boundary between what was proper and what was not had begun to blur. Anaya found herself rearranging her daily schedule without realizing it. She took longer walks, timed perfectly when she knew Rohan would be out. She chose brighter clothes, touched her hair more often, carried herself with a confidence that had long been absent. Victor, buried in work and phone calls, did not notice. He was more concerned with financial deadlines and late-night reports than with the subtle changes in his wife. To him, her sudden liveliness was nothing more than a phase, a distraction she had found to fill her time. The secrecy was what fueled the fire. The thrill of not being discovered, of keeping something so intimate hidden in plain sight, gave Anaya a dangerous kind of joy. It wasn't love in the traditional sense. It was an escape, a rebellion against the prison of loneliness she had endured for years. Every brief encounter left her heart racing long after she returned to her home. It was addictive, and she knew. Rohan's interest, however, began to deepen into something far more consuming. For him, it wasn't merely about attention or flirtation. He began to imagine what life could be like with Anaya. Away from the watchful eye of his mother, away from the expectations of his future. He started to obsess over her presence, noting her routines, her subtle smiles, the way she seemed to glow whenever they crossed paths. What was a passing distraction for her was becoming an obsession for him. Meanwhile, the suburb carried on as if nothing unusual was happening. Children played in driveways, sprinklers watered freshly cut lawns, and neighbors exchanged pleasantries. Beneath the surface, however, a secret affair was beginning to take root. The very air around Anaya's home felt charged, as though the walls themselves were absorbing the tension she tried to hide. She told herself she was in control. She convinced herself that these encounters were harmless, that she could walk away whenever she would. But control was slipping, and she didn't see it. Rohan's eagerness grew bolder. He lingered outside longer, found reasons to be near her, and sometimes left hints of his presence. A wave from across the street, a look that lasted too long, a step closer than necessary. Each time, she felt her resolve weaken, even as fear whispered in the back of her mind. The danger of discovery loomed over them like a storm cloud. Neighbors had sharp eyes, and even Mrs. Delmar began to notice her son's unusual restlessness. She dismissed it as youthful boredom, unaware of the deeper truth. Anaya's heart raced each time she imagined what might happen if Victor ever noticed. Yet, in her loneliness, she ignored the warnings her conscience whispered. The affair had not yet crossed into the physical, but the intensity between them was undeniable. It was a spark that had grown into a flame, hidden behind curtains and polite smiles. And like any flame left unchecked, it was destined to spread beyond control. Anaya and Rohan were walking a line so thin that it could snap at any moment. And once it did, nothing in their quiet suburban street would ever be the same again. As the weeks rolled on, the fragile balance between secrecy and discovery began to collapse. What had started as fleeting encounters and suggestive glances had grown into something much more dangerous. Rohan Delmar was no longer satisfied with stolen moments and unspoken promises. His youth and impulsiveness drove him to demand more, to push boundaries that Anaya Khurana had once sworn she would never cross. She found herself caught between the intoxicating thrill of his attention and the suffocating fear that their secret would come crashing into the open. Rohan began to test limits in ways that unsettled her. He sent messages late at night, words heavy with longing and impatience. He appeared suddenly in places she frequented, a coffee shop, a bookstore, always pretending coincidence, though she knew better. His presence grew invasive, filling every corner of her once empty life. She told herself she could manage it, but in truth, the control she once clung to had slipped entirely into his hands. Victor Khurana, though still immersed in his career, was not completely blind. His years of analyzing numbers had trained him to notice patterns, and now he began to notice irregularities in his home. His wife, who had once been quietly reserved, seemed strangely restless. Her phone always in her hand, her walks longer than usual, her mood oddly brighter when she thought no one was watching. He did not have evidence, but suspicion coiled inside him, a silent unease he could not shake. He began to pay closer attention, though his work obligations chained him to long hours. One evening, a subtle shift in routine raised his doubts further. Anaya, who had always prepared dinner promptly, delayed the meal until much later. She appeared distracted, her eyes darting toward the window as if expecting something. Victor said nothing, but the silence between them felt heavier than usual, filled with unspoken questions. He began quietly watching her, measuring her actions with the same scrutiny he applied to his ledgers, searching for flaws that might reveal the truth. Rohan, meanwhile, grew reckless. He convinced himself that their connection was more than an escape for Anaya. To him it was destiny. His youth did not allow him to separate fantasy from reality, and each passing day only deepened his obsession. He began to resent Victor, seeing him as an obstacle, a man who did not deserve the woman he adored. His thoughts turned darker, his emotions more volatile, and he started to believe that removing Victor was the only path forward. The suburb, outwardly peaceful, began to feel like a stage where hidden drama played behind closed curtains. Neighbors exchanged smiles and greetings, unaware of the invisible storm building within the Khurana household. Even Miss Delmar, intuitive as a mother, sensed something unusual in her son's behavior. He was restless at night, distracted during the day, carrying a tension that made her uneasy. But she dismissed it, attributing it to the frustrations of youth. The turning point came on an evening that began like any other. Victor had returned from work earlier than usual, hoping to surprise Anaya. He walked into the house to find her startled, her phone quickly tucked away, her eyes wide with panic. He said nothing, but inside him, suspicions hardened into certainty. Later that night, as he prepared documents in his study, he resolved to confront the truth in his own quiet way. Rohan, however, was already on his way to the Khurana home, unaware that Victor was there. His impulsive decision to visit uninvited was born out of jealousy and desperation. He could no longer bear to wait, could no longer stand the secrecy. His footsteps echoed against the driveway as he approached, his heart pounding not with fear, but with the thrill of forbidden desire. Inside, Anaya's world began to collapse the moment she heard the knock on the door. Panic surged through her veins. She knew instantly who it was, and she knew equally well that her carefully constructed secrecy had finally reached its breaking point. The thin thread she had walked for weeks was about to snap, and when it did, the consequences would be irreversible. That night, 3 lives collided in a confrontation none of them had planned. The house that had once stood as a symbol of suburban peace was now a powder keg waiting for the spark. In the silence before it all erupted, Anaya realized she had lost control completely, and the choices she had made were now about to demand their price. The moment the door opened, the fragile illusion of secrecy shattered. Anaya Khurana's eyes widened as she saw Rohan Delmar standing there, his presence heavy and dangerous in the dim light of her home. He wasn't supposed to be there, not tonight, not when Victor was in the study with his papers spread across the desk. Her pulse raced, her throat tightening with fear as she tried to signal to Rohan, but he had already stepped inside. His confidence was reckless, his body language full of a defiance that ignored the risk. He thought he was claiming what was his, but in truth, he was dragging them both toward disaster. Victor emerged from the hallway, surprised at the sight before him. He had expected another evening of silence, of numbers and exhaustion, but instead he found a young man standing in his home, his wife pale and trembling beside him. The tension that had been building for weeks suddenly became visible, sharp enough to cut through the air. Victor's questions never came aloud. The answers were already etched across Anaya's face, in the guilt that clung to her eyes and the fear that betrayed her every movement. The argument that followed was not one of words but of presence. Rohan stepped forward, his jaw tight, his fists clenched, the fury of youth burning inside him. Victor squared his shoulders, older but unshaken, the weight of betrayal hardening his resolve. Anaya stood frozen, a silent witness to the 2 worlds she had foolishly tried to balance colliding in front of her. The quiet of the suburban night outside stood in stark contrast to the storm brewing inside the Khurana home. The kitchen became the center of the chaos. Rohan's voice rose, not in measured explanation, but in a desperate plea for recognition. He demanded what could never be his obsession boiling over into rage. Victor, in a rare burst of anger, moved toward him, his authority as husband and head of the household pushing against Rohan's youthful defiance. The clash was inevitable, their bodies colliding, the sound of furniture crashing to the floor echoing through the house. In the midst of the struggle, hands reached for whatever was closest. The gleam of a kitchen knife caught in the light for only a second, before it was gripped tightly, lifted high and driven forward. The blade pierced Victor's chest with a sickening force, and the life that had been spent building stability and order was undone in a single violent motion. His body staggered, his eyes wide with disbelief, before collapsing onto the polished tile. Blood spread quickly, a dark red pool that reflected the overhead light like a cruel mirror. Anaya let out a soundless cry, her body trembling as she fell to her knees beside her husband. Her hands shook violently as she reached for him, but the warmth of his body was already fading. The weight of her choices crashed upon her like a tidal wave, suffocating her with the reality of what had just happened. The man who had once been her anchor now lay lifeless, the stability of her life broken beyond repair. Rohan stood frozen for a moment, his chest heaving, the knife still slick with blood in his hand. The enormity of what he had done hadn't yet registered in his mind. He tried to justify it silently, telling himself it was necessary, that it was the only way they could be together. But as Anaya looked at him with horror instead of love, the truth began to seep into his thoughts. He hadn't won her. He had destroyed everything. The silence after the violence was unbearable. The suburban street outside remained calm, the occasional bark of a dog, or the faint hum of a passing car oblivious to the tragedy unfolding inside. Anaya scrambled to her feet, her hands red with her husband's blood, trying in vain to wipe the evidence away. She begged silently for this to be undone, for time to rewind, but the crimson stain spreading across the floor told her that there was no return. Rohan's panic finally took hold, and he dropped the knife, the clatter echoing through the house like a final admission of guilt. He bolted toward the door, his footsteps loud and frantic as he fled into the night. Anaya was left alone with the body of her husband, the sound of his last breath still echoing in her ears. She pressed her hands against the wound, but it was useless. Her tears blurred her vision, as she realized that not only had she lost her husband, but her lover had abandoned her, to face the consequences alone. The night stretched endlessly as she sat in the pool of blood, her mind fractured by the weight of what had just taken place. The walls of her home, once symbols of comfort and respectability, now felt like a prison closing in on her. Outside, the world carried on as if nothing had happened, but within those walls, the suburban dream had collapsed into a nightmare of betrayal, violence, and irreversible loss. Detective Miles Orson arrived at the Khurana residence just after dawn, summoned by a frantic 911 from a neighbor who reported unusual noises and movement in the night. The quiet suburban street looked the same as it always did: children's bicycles on driveways, sprinklers watering green lawns, but inside one of its homes lay the aftermath of a crime that would shatter its peace forever. The living room still smelled faintly of bleach, but the floor bore the undeniable stains of blood that had seeped deep into the tiles. Victor Khurana's body had already been taken to the coroner's office, but the silence of the house told its own story. Something about it was too neat, too forced, as if someone had tried to erase the truth but had failed. Anaya Khurana sat on the couch, pale and hollow-eyed, her hands trembling despite her attempts to appear composed. The detective observed her closely. Her story was fragmented, her voice unsteady as she described waking to find her husband fatally wounded. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks or shattered glass, and that detail alone unraveled her narrative. Orson's instincts, sharpened by years of dealing with liars and manipulators, told him that the woman sitting before him was withholding more than she confessed. The investigation unfolded quickly. Phone records painted a damning picture. Rohan Delmar's number appeared repeatedly on Anaya's call logs, late into the night and early in the mornings. Text messages, deleted but recoverable, revealed not only their intimacy, but also their growing recklessness. The affair was no longer speculation, it was documented. Witness statements from neighbors added weight to the suspicion. Several had noticed Rohan lingering around the Khurana home at odd hours, and one recalled seeing him enter the house the very night Victor was killed. Detective Orson turned his attention to Rohan. The young man had fled, but not far enough. His belongings, hastily packed, were discovered at a bus station on the outskirts of the city. It didn't take long for officers to track him down, hiding in a rundown motel room, his clothes still stained faintly with blood despite his attempt to wash them. The fear in his eyes betrayed his guilt even before the evidence was laid out against him. He was brought in, silent and defiant at first, but under questioning, his arrogance faltered. Anaya and Rohan's stories diverged sharply. She admitted to the affair, though framing it as a mistake born of loneliness. She insisted that Rohan had grown obsessive, that she had tried to end it, and that the murder of her husband was his doing alone. Rohan, however, painted a different picture. He claimed Anaya had manipulated him, feeding his obsession, whispering her dissatisfaction with Victor, and fueling the idea that life would be better without her husband. Each pointed at the other, each trying desperately to save themselves, but the evidence did not absolve either of them. Forensic reports confirmed what Orson suspected. The knife bore Rohan's prints, but the attempts to clean the crime scene carried Anaya's unmistakable touch. She had tried to erase what had happened, scrubbing surfaces, rearranging objects, and attempting to stage the scene as a robbery gone wrong. Her desperation tied her to the crime as much as Rohan's violent act did.
Together they had destroyed Victor Khurana's life, and now their own futures were bound by the same chain of guilt. The trial became a spectacle, the story of an Indian housewife and a young neighbor's son capturing headlines far beyond the quiet suburb where it had all begun. The courtroom air was thick with tension, as prosecutors laid out the tangled web of betrayal, obsession and violence. Anaya, once the picture of composure, broke down repeatedly under cross-examination, her grief mingling with guilt. Rohan, once arrogant, shrank into himself as the weight of the evidence crushed his bravado. The verdict was merciless. Rohan was convicted of first-degree murder, sentenced to life behind prison walls where the reckless impulses of youth would fade into years of regret. Anaya was found guilty of conspiracy and obstruction of justice, her role in the cover-up sealing her fate. She was sentenced to decades in prison, her once quiet life now reduced to the cold confines of a cell. The Khurana home was eventually sold, its walls scrubbed clean and repainted, but neighbors still whispered when they passed. The street, once ordinary, carried the scar of tragedy that could never truly be erased. For those who lived there, the memory of blood on the tiles and secrets behind closed doors lingered as a chilling reminder of how easily passion could turn to destruction. What had started as stolen glances across a suburban street had ended in betrayal, violence and ruin, a cautionary tale that love, when twisted by loneliness and obsession, can become as lethal as any weapon.